the black pine's Enigma. The crisp autumn air clung to the skin of Emily and Josh as they unpacked their gear at the edge of Black Pine's forest. Leaves crunched beneath their boots, and the scent of pine mixed with the cool earth, grounding them to the rawness of the wilderness around them. They were deep in the Adirondacks, far from cell towers, Wi-Fi signals, and city lights. This was exactly what they'd wanted, a weekend to themselves, to disconnect and rediscover each other. "Can you believe this place?" Josh said, his voice low with awe. He zipped open his backpack, pulling out a map marked with red ink. The trails they'd planned to follow squiggled like thin veins through the dense clusters of forest. "It's beautiful," Emily replied, running her fingers along the bark of a towering spruce. She felt like they'd stepped into another world, a place that hadn't changed in centuries. Her voice turned playful. "But I don't want to get lost, so don't go too far off track." Josh rolled his eyes but grinned. "Come on, it's just us and a few raccoons. We'll be fine." The sun hovered low in the sky, casting long amber rays that slanted through the trees. Shadows stretched and shifted as the wind rustled through the branches. They began their hike toward a hidden clearing that Josh had read about, a secluded spot perfect for pitching their tent. It would take a few hours, but they were in no rush. As they walked deeper into the forest, the quiet settled around them, thick and almost unnerving. Every sound seemed amplified. The crack of a twig, the faint rustle of leaves, even their own breathing. A bird called in the distance, sharp and piercing, before falling silent again. "Feels like we're the only people left in the world," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Josh chuckled softly, but even he felt it, the way the forest seemed to close in around them. He reached out, lacing his fingers through hers. "You scared?" he teased, though his own voice was quieter now. "No," Emily replied, though her tone carried a hint of uncertainty. "It's just different out here. It feels ancient, like it's alive." The trail twisted and narrowed as they ventured deeper, the trees growing taller and more twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The sunlight struggled to pierce through the canopy, casting the world in shadowed hues. The forest grew colder, and the silence became oppressive. Then, just as they reached a small clearing, they noticed something odd. A faint smell hung in the air, sharp and metallic, like rusting iron. Emily's nose wrinkled, and she glanced over at Josh. "Do you smell that?" Josh nodded, his expression shifting to one of confusion. He scanned the clearing, his gaze landing on a dark stain on the ground, partially obscured by fallen leaves. He bent down, pushing the leaves aside, revealing a patch of earth soaked a deep, dark red. It looked fresh, glistening faintly under the dim light. "Is that blood?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Josh stood up, his face pale. "Maybe a hunter was here, or a wounded animal. Let's keep going." But as they walked away from the clearing, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced back, her heart hammering, but saw nothing unusual, just trees stretching back into darkness. The metallic smell lingered, as though following them. And then, just as they rounded a bend, Emily heard it, a faint rustling sound, coming from somewhere just beyond the trees. It was too slow and deliberate to be an animal. She paused, looking back. "Josh, did you hear that?" He stopped, turning to face her, a crease of worry on his brow. "Hear what?" But before she could answer, the sound vanished. As the sun dipped below the treetops, the forest took on a darker, colder tone. Long shadows stretched over the trail, merging with the quietness that had settled around them. Emily felt a chill prickle up her spine, but she forced herself to brush it off. She and Josh had spent months planning this trip. She wasn't about to let nerves ruin it. They reached the clearing Josh had marked on his map just as dusk descended fully. It was a beautiful, almost perfect campsite. A flat area ringed by tall pines, a few boulders scattered about, and a clear patch where they could set up their tent. In the center, there was already a small fire pit left by other campers, a simple circle of stones. Josh dropped his pack with a satisfied sigh. "Told you it'd be perfect." Emily smiled, though she couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had been growing since they found that dark, rusty stain. She set her bag down beside his, trying to focus on the sounds of the forest coming alive at night, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. The two of them worked quickly, setting up the tent and gathering firewood. Josh pulled out a small bundle of kindling and a lighter from his pack, and soon, a warm fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows that danced across their faces. Emily pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders as they settled down on a log near the fire. "I'm starved," Josh said, pulling out a bag of marshmallows. "Want some?" Emily laughed, accepting one. "You always think of the important things." They roasted marshmallows in comfortable silence, watching as stars began to blink into existence above the trees. For a while, Emily relaxed. She leaned into Josh's side, letting the warmth of the fire and the simplicity of the moment ease her mind. But then, a soft sound floated through the night air. A faint whisper carried by the breeze, so quiet it almost sounded like the trees themselves were speaking. Emily straightened, her eyes scanning the forest, trying to make out the source of the sound. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Josh looked up from his marshmallow, frowning. "Hear what?" "That sound, like whispering." She strained her ears, but the noise had vanished, swallowed by the quiet. "Maybe it's just the wind," she said, trying to convince herself. Josh shrugged, his brow furrowing slightly. "Probably. Out here, every little noise sounds bigger." Emily nodded, but something about the sound had unsettled her. It hadn't seemed like just the wind. It had felt intentional, like someone was trying to get close without being seen. The feeling of being watched crept back over her, prickling at her skin. She scanned the darkness around them, peering into the trees. Shadows danced just beyond the fire's glow, shifting and flickering in a way that made it hard to tell where one shadow ended and another began. "Hey," Josh said softly, noticing her tense posture. "You okay?" She forced a smile, brushing it off. "Yeah, just getting spooked by my own imagination." "Classic horror movie stuff, right?" Josh chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Well, lucky for you, you've got a horror movie expert here." They laughed, the sound echoing lightly through the clearing, and for a moment the feeling faded. But when they finally crawled into the tent, zipping it up against the chill, Emily felt that prickle of unease return. She could hear Josh's breathing deepen beside her as he drifted off, but she lay awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling of the tent, listening. Then, just as her own eyelids began to grow heavy, she heard it again, a faint whispering sound. This time, it was closer, just outside their tent. It was a low, raspy murmur, rising and falling, like the forest itself was speaking. Her breath hitched. She lay frozen, every muscle tensed as she strained to listen. The whispering grew softer, fading into the night, but it had left a chilling message in her mind, one she couldn't shake. "Turn back." Emily's hand crept over to Josh, shaking him awake. He stirred, groggy and confused. "What's wrong?" "Listen," she whispered, her heart pounding. But when he held his breath, waiting, there was only silence. It's nothing," he murmured, barely awake. "Just the wind." He closed his eyes, drifting off once more. But Emily knew what she'd heard. Morning sunlight filtered through the thin walls of the tent, casting a soft golden glow over everything. Emily blinked awake, her sleep uneasy and filled with strange dreams. She could still feel the lingering echo of that whisper, its warning repeating in her mind. "Turn back." She lay still, watching the gentle rise and fall of Josh's chest as he slept beside her, blissfully unaware of the strange sounds that had haunted her through the night. Part of her wanted to shake him awake, tell him everything, but another part felt foolish. Maybe it had just been the wind, amplified by the isolation and darkness. But as she lay there, she couldn't ignore the nagging sense that something wasn't right. She carefully slipped out of her sleeping bag, hoping a morning walk might ease her nerves. Outside, the air was crisp and cool, smelling faintly of pine and damp earth. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh morning air. But as she turned to scan the clearing, something caught her eye, a series of dark, smeared impressions on the ground, just beyond the perimeter of their campsite. Tracks. She crouched down, brushing her fingers over the dirt. The tracks were elongated and thin, with claw-like impressions at the ends. They didn't look like the prints of any animal she recognized, and they were much larger than a human footprint, almost grotesquely stretched. A chill crept up her spine, and she glanced back at the tent. Josh was still asleep, blissfully unaware. She wanted to call him over, show him what she'd found, but something stopped her. Some primal instinct told her to stay quiet. Instead, she traced the tracks with her eyes. They led from the edge of the clearing, stopping just a few feet from their tent. Her heart hammered as she realized that whatever had made these prints had come incredibly close while they'd been sleeping. The sound of the tent zipper made her jump, and she spun around to see Josh emerging, stretching and yawning. He grinned at her sleepily. "Morning, early bird." She forced a smile, trying to keep the worry from her face. "Good morning?" Josh raised an eyebrow as he noticed her crouched near the tracks. "What are you looking at?" Tracks." She straightened, gesturing to the prints. "Do these look strange to you?" He stepped closer, squinting at the impressions in the ground. "Weird. Maybe a bear or something?" Emily shook her head. "Bears don't usually have footprints like that. And look at the shape. It's like something stretched." Josh frowned, clearly considering her words. Could be a big animal dragging something, maybe? But there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. "Maybe," she replied, but doubt lingered in her mind. She looked around, scanning the trees for any other signs, any hint of movement, but everything was still, too still. No birds chirped, and the usual rustle of squirrels and small animals was absent. The forest was holding its breath. Josh glanced back at her, his casual grin fading as he noticed her unease. "Are you still spooked from last night? You sure you heard something?" She hesitated, wondering if she should tell him everything, the whisper, the sense that they were being watched, the way the voice had seemed to carry a warning. But even as she opened her mouth to speak, she felt the weight of her own doubt. I think I just let my imagination get to me," she said, forcing a small laugh. "But maybe we should be a little cautious." Josh nodded, rubbing his neck thoughtfully. "All right, we'll be on alert." He gave her a reassuring smile. "Let's just make breakfast and go for a hike. I bet once we're moving, everything will feel better." Emily tried to relax, letting herself get swept up in the familiar routine. They ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and packed a few snacks before setting off on a trail that wound deeper into the woods. The tracks were left behind in the clearing, but the memory of them lingered with every step. The forest felt different in the daylight, more open, less foreboding. Shafts of sunlight broke through the canopy, casting warm patches of light on the forest floor. Still, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone, that something was watching them from just beyond her line of sight. After an hour, they reached a small hill overlooking a valley. Josh let out a low whistle, admiring the view. "See? This is what we came here for." Emily managed to smile, pushing down the lingering dread. The valley stretched before them, covered in a rich patchwork of autumn colors, fiery reds, golden yellows, and deep greens. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, to let go of the feeling that had gnawed at her all morning. But as they turned to continue down the trail, she noticed something peculiar near a large tree a few yards away. Strange symbols had been carved into the bark, faint but unmistakable. Jagged lines and spirals, some resembling claw marks, others too intricate to be random. She stopped, staring at the carvings, a sense of unease washing over her. Josh followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "What's that?" "I don't know," she murmured, tracing the marks with her finger without touching them. The carvings felt wrong, like they carried some dark meaning just out of reach. "Looks like someone's idea of a prank," Josh said, though his voice lacked conviction. He studied the carvings for a moment, then looked at her. "Think it's locals trying to spook hikers?" Emily didn't answer. She couldn't shake the feeling that these carvings weren't left as a joke. They were a warning, one that echoed the voice she'd heard last night. They both turned away from the tree, and as they continued down the trail, Emily felt her anxiety grow. The forest had grown quieter, the shadows darker, and with each step, she felt that they were being led somewhere. Somewhere they weren't supposed to go. As the day wore on, the chill in the air grew sharper, sinking into Emily's skin. The trees around them seemed to close in tighter, the path becoming narrower and more twisted. Every sound felt amplified, yet the forest was too quiet, as though the usual hum of life had retreated from something lurking unseen. Josh remained cheerful, doing his best to keep the mood light. He pointed out small, interesting details in the forest, mushrooms sprouting from rotting logs, the occasional glimpse of wildlife scurrying away in the distance. But Emily could barely focus. Her mind kept drifting back to the tracks, the strange symbols, the whisper. They'd hiked several miles before finally stopping near a small trickling creek. Emily dropped her pack with a sigh, grateful for the break. She took a deep drink from her water bottle, glancing at the surrounding trees as if something might step out at any moment. "All right, Emily," Josh said, wiping his brow. "Time for the horror movie queen to relax." He handed her a granola bar, then tilted his head with a small grin. "You've been so tense all day. Think the spooky carvings got to you?" She managed a laugh, but it felt forced. "Maybe a little. It's just, I don't know. I keep getting this feeling like we're not alone." Josh chuckled, but when he looked at her, his gaze softened. "Hey, I get it. It's a lot being out here by ourselves. Maybe we'll make a quick stop back at camp, then take a day hike to distract ourselves?" Emily nodded, feeling a bit of relief. Returning to camp felt safer somehow, a familiar place in this dense, unsettling forest. But as they started back, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The light had taken on an odd, hazy quality, casting the forest in a dim grayish-green hue. Shadows deepened, clinging to the bases of trees, and the silence grew thicker. The trail that had seemed so clear earlier was beginning to feel indistinct, as if the forest itself was changing around them. They continued in silence until Emily noticed something strange, a figure in the distance. She stopped, her heart hammering. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but there was a shape between the trees, standing still, too still. "Josh," she whispered, clutching his arm. He followed her gaze, and his face went pale as he saw it too. The figure was tall, gaunt, its limbs impossibly long, blending almost seamlessly into the shadows of the forest. The longer she looked, the harder it was to distinguish it from the twisted shapes of the trees around it. But there was something unmistakably human, or inhuman, about the way it stood, slightly hunched, as if watching them. "Who is that?" Emily stammered, barely able to find her voice. Josh swallowed, his voice low. "Maybe it's a hiker?" But even as he spoke, his tone was unsure, the words hollow. The figure remained motionless, and then, just as quickly as they had seen it, it melted backward into the forest, vanishing without a sound. "Let's keep moving," Josh whispered, his eyes wide, glancing back at Emily with a new sense of urgency. They both knew they'd seen something that defied explanation, yet neither wanted to put words to it. They picked up their pace, following the path back toward their campsite. But as they walked, Emily began noticing something even more alarming. The familiar markers of their trail, bent saplings, a distinctive patch of lichen, and other small details, were missing. The trees all looked alike, their trunks dark and twisted, branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal arms. "Josh, I think we're lost," she said, a tremor in her voice. Josh stopped, pulling out the map and squinting at it in the dim light. "That can't be possible. We followed the same trail back." Emily shook her head, panic rising. "But it doesn't look the same. It's like the forest has changed." Josh looked up, and for the first time since they'd started their trip, he looked genuinely afraid. He tried to hide it with a reassuring smile. "Okay, let's just keep calm. Maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere. We'll retrace our steps." They backtracked, but no matter which way they went, every path felt like it was leading them deeper, into the forest. It was as though the trees themselves were shifting, guiding them in circles. Shadows loomed larger, the silence growing heavier with each passing minute. Just when Emily felt like she couldn't hold it together any longer, she spotted something up ahead. A break in the trees. They rushed toward it, desperate to escape the twisting maze of shadows, and stumbled into a clearing. But the sight that greeted them made Emily's blood run cold. The clearing was filled with bones, scattered remains of animals and birds, bleached white against the dark earth. They lay in strange patterns, arranged in spirals and circles that mirrored the carvings they'd seen earlier. At the center of the clearing stood a rough makeshift totem, a pile of sticks, feathers, and more bones, tied together with frayed pieces of cloth. Josh took a step back, his voice a shaky whisper. "What? What is this?" Emily felt bile rise in her throat, her stomach twisting. The air around them felt thick, oppressive, as though the forest itself was watching, waiting. And then she heard it again. The whisper. Turn back. It was louder this time, urgent, as if it were inside her head, filling every corner of her mind. She clutched her temples, closing her eyes to shut it out. But the voice grew stronger, resonating through her, raw and filled with desperation. "Emily?" Josh's voice was barely audible over the whisper, his face pale. She opened her eyes to see him staring at her, his own hand pressed to his head. Did you hear that too?" Before she could answer, they both heard a rustling from the far side of the clearing. Their heads snapped in that direction, and Emily's heart dropped as she saw the figure again, closer this time, standing just at the edge of the trees. It was taller than she'd realized, its limbs impossibly thin and elongated, its body twisted in unnatural angles. And though its face was obscured in shadow, she could feel its gaze, cold, unfeeling, yet somehow filled with a hunger that went deeper than mere flesh. Emily and Josh froze, caught in a primal terror. The figure tilted its head as if studying them, and then it took a single step forward. The ground seemed to tremble beneath its footfall, a low, resonant thud that echoed through the clearing. The whisper returned, clearer now, almost pleading. "Run." Emily grabbed Josh's hand, her voice barely a strangled whisper. "We need to go, now." Without another word, they turned and sprinted, plunging back into the maze of trees, leaving the clearing of bones and the twisted figure behind. They didn't look back. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet as they ran, desperate to escape the presence that stalked them in the shadows. But as they fled, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how fast or far they ran, the forest was leading them back. The forest seemed to close in around them as they ran, branches clawing at their clothes, roots tripping. At their feet. Emily felt her lungs burning, each breath sharp and shallow, but she dared not slow down. Josh was right beside her, his face twisted with fear and determination as they crashed through the underbrush. The trees stretched endlessly before them, towering giants with crooked, knotted limbs, all looking the same no matter which direction they turned. There was no sense of time. They could have been running for minutes or hours. All Emily knew was the sheer terror that drove her forward, the sense that if they stopped, something horrible would reach out from the shadows and take them. Eventually, they burst into another clearing, their frantic pace slowing as they gasped for breath. Emily bent over, clutching her knees as she struggled to steady herself. Josh stumbled beside her, his hands on his head as he tried to process their predicament. "We can't keep this up," he panted, glancing around with wide eyes. "It's like we're running in circles." Emily didn't respond immediately. Her gaze was fixed on the clearing around them, her pulse racing. This place was different. Unlike the last clearing, there were no bones or strange symbols. But there was something deeply unsettling about it, an unnatural quiet, as if the forest itself was watching them, waiting. Then she noticed it, the faintest outline of a path, barely visible, winding through the grass at the edge of the clearing. It was narrow and overgrown, but it was there, a possible way out. She nudged Josh, pointing to the path. "Look, maybe it leads somewhere. Safe," she whispered, though she could hardly believe her own words. Josh looked doubtful, but he nodded, exhaustion clear on his face. "Anything's better than staying here." They followed the path in silence, each step quiet and deliberate, as if they were afraid of alerting. something lurking just beyond the trees. The forest grew darker as they walked, the light filtering through the canopy turning gray and muted, casting long shadows that stretched toward them. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch or rustle of leaves beneath their feet. After what felt like an eternity, the path veered around a dense thicket and led them to a small, open space. At the center stood a weathered cabin, its wooden walls covered in moss, the windows dark and clouded. Emily felt a surge of relief mixed with trepidation. Someone had once lived here. Maybe this place would offer them some form of protection, or at least shelter. Josh stepped forward, reaching for the rusted handle on the cabin door. He hesitated, glancing at her, his eyes asking a silent question. Emily gave a slight nod, and he pulled the door open with a creak that echoed through the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of damp wood and dust. It was dark, save for faint beams of light filtering through the cracked windows, casting odd shadows on the walls. The interior was sparse, with a rough wooden table and a single chair, a small stone hearth in the corner, and a pile of old moth-eaten blankets on the floor. Emily stepped inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. Her gaze settled on the walls, which were lined with strange markings, more of the symbols they'd seen carved into the trees, but more detailed, precise. Some looked like twisted faces, others like hands or claws, reaching out as though frozen mid-grasp. She shuddered, turning away. "Who would live here?" Josh muttered, inspecting the symbols with a mix of horror and fascination. "And why would they cover the walls with TVs?" Emily shook her head, hugging her arms around herself. "I don't know, but I don't think they're just decorations." They moved further into the cabin, careful to avoid the strange markings, and came to a small shelf lined with brittle, ancient-looking books. Josh picked one up, flipping it open to reveal pages filled with cramped handwriting. The words were in a language Emily didn't recognize, jagged characters that twisted across the pages like thorned vines. She felt a chill as she looked over Josh's shoulder, though she couldn't read the text. "What does it say?" she whispered, though she didn't expect him to know. Josh shook his head, running a finger along the symbols. "No idea, but look here." He flipped through several pages, stopping at a hand-drawn illustration. It depicted a figure tall and thin, with limbs that seemed to stretch beyond natural proportions, fingers ending in claw-like tips. Its face was an empty void, dark and hollow, and its eyes were two bottomless pits. The figure loomed over a human silhouette, watching from the shadows. Emily's blood ran cold. That's what we saw. In the forest. Josh swallowed, his face pale. "There's more." He turned the page, revealing another drawing, a forest clearing, filled with symbols and bones arranged in patterns. The creature loomed at the edge, watching, waiting. As she looked at the page, Emily felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if she'd seen it before, lived it somehow. Her gaze drifted to the next page, and her breath caught. The illustration depicted two figures, a man and a woman, fleeing through the forest, chased by the same hollow-eyed figure. Josh dropped the book, his hands trembling. It's like it's telling our story." A low, rumbling sound reverberated through the cabin, shaking the walls. Emily and Josh froze, their eyes darting around the room. The rumble grew louder, then faded, replaced by a slow, dragging sound that came from just outside the cabin, circling around it. Emily's heart raced, and she clutched Josh's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "It's here." They backed away from the door, pressing themselves against the far wall as the sound grew louder, stopping just outside the entrance. They held their breath, listening as something scraped against the wooden walls of the cabin, moving slowly, as though savoring the moment. A shadow passed by the window, long and twisted, casting a dark shape across the floor. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, trying to will herself invisible, silent. The presence lingered, filling the air with a thick, suffocating tension. Then, the whisper returned, as if the very walls were breathing it. "Turn back, or be taken." Emily's eyes flew open, meeting Josh's terrified gaze. He mouthed one word, "Run." In one fluid motion, they bolted for the back door, throwing it open and plunging into the forest once more. The instant they left the cabin, the dragging sound stopped, replaced by the rapid, echoing sound of something pursuing them, crashing through the undergrowth with inhuman speed. They sprinted through the forest, guided only by a primal instinct to survive. The forest had grown even darker, shadows shifting and twisting in their peripheral vision. Emily didn't dare look back, but she could feel it gaining on them, feel the cold, hollow gaze boring into her. The whisper followed them, echoing in her mind, chilling her to her core. Turn back, turn back. They burst into another clearing, their lungs burning, their bodies spent. Emily stumbled, and Josh grabbed her arm, pulling her upright. She looked around, her vision blurred, but one thing became horrifyingly clear. They were back in the same clearing of bones and symbols, back where the strange totem stood like a twisted guardian. Josh's face contorted with horror. How? How did we? Before he could finish, the whisper turned into a guttural growl, echoing through the clearing. Emily looked up, her eyes wide with terror, as the figure emerged from the shadows, standing at the edge of the clearing, taller and more menacing than before. This time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't a person, nor an animal. It was something ancient, something that didn't belong in their world. Its limbs hung long and crooked, claws sharp and gleaming in the dim light. Its hollow eyes fixed on them, cold and unfeeling, yet filled with a hunger that was beyond mortal understanding. Emily's mind raced, the whispered warning echoing in her thoughts. Turn back, or be taken. But now, as the creature stepped forward, she realized the truth. There was no turning back. They were already too far in. The creature advanced slowly, each step an unsettling blend of deliberate grace and unnatural silence. Its limbs moved with a grotesque fluidity, and the shadow of its hollow gaze seemed to pierce straight into Emily's soul. She felt frozen, like a deer in headlights, caught in the gaze of something ancient and malevolent. Josh pulled at her arm, snapping her out of her stupor. "Emily, we have to move!" But where could they go? The clearings seemed to close in around them, the trees stretching higher, their branches twisting together in a tangled canopy that blocked out even the faintest glimmers of daylight. The forest, dense and alive, was pressing them toward the center of the clearing as though it too was part of the creature's will. A low, guttural sound rumbled from the creature's throat, a noise that was neither animal nor human but something that defied nature itself. It tilted its head, and though it had no discernible eyes, Emily could feel its focus shift to her. A chilling whisper, like a hissing breath, echoed through her mind. The price must be paid. What? What is it saying? Josh stammered, his grip on her arm tightening. She realized he'd heard it too. She shook her head, her heart pounding. I don't know, but it's like it wants something from us. They took a few hesitant steps backward, but the creature didn't falter. Its movement was unhurried, almost mocking, as if it knew they were trapped. They weren't running from it. They were being drawn into something they didn't understand. Emily's gaze darted around the clearing, desperate for anything that might help them. Her eyes landed on the totem in the center of the clearing, the twisted pile of bones, sticks, and feathers they'd seen earlier. It felt like a focal point, the heart of this dark ritual. Maybe if they could destroy it. Josh, she whispered, keeping her voice low, do you see that totem? I think it's connected to this thing somehow. We have to break it. He looked at her, confused and terrified, but there was a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. Do you think? I don't know. But I think it's the only chance we've got. They exchanged a silent nod, then sprinted toward the totem, moving in a wild dash through the clearing. The creature's movements shifted in response, a low growl vibrating through the air as it began to advance with greater urgency. It was no longer holding back. They reached the totem, its twisted structure looming over them like a grotesque idol. Up close, Emily could see the strange carvings etched into the bones, spirals and faces, symbols that seemed to pulse with dark energy. Every instinct screamed at her to stay away, but she pushed through her fear. "Help me pull it down," she shouted, grabbing one of the larger sticks and yanking with all her strength. Josh joined her, his fingers digging into the brittle material. With a final heave, they managed to topple the structure, the bones and sticks clattering to the ground. But instead of feeling relief, a new wave of dread washed over them. The forest fell silent, too silent. It was as if every living thing in the area had paused, holding its breath. Then, a piercing scream echoed through the clearing, a sound so sharp and filled with fury that it made the air vibrate. Emily clapped her hands over her ears, her heart racing. The creature staggered, its form wavering like a mirage. For a moment, Emily thought they'd done it, that the totem had somehow weakened it. But then it straightened, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, and let out a horrible, guttural roar. The sound seemed to crack the air itself, reverberating through the forest, as if calling to something deeper and darker than itself. The ground beneath them trembled, and the symbols carved into the bones of the fallen totem began to glow faintly, as though they were infused with a malevolent life of their own. Shadows started to swirl around the clearing, converging toward the creature, who now seemed to draw strength from the very darkness around it. Emily grabbed Josh's hand, terror gripping her heart. "We need to get out of here, now." They turned to run, but the shadows pooled before them, rising up like a wall, blocking their escape. The creature stepped forward, a thin, clawed hand reaching out, and Emily felt the chill of it even from where she stood. The air grew colder, filled with a sense of despair so profound it threatened to drown her. She looked back at Josh, her eyes wide with terror. We can't get out." He looked around wildly, his face pale and drawn. "What does it want from us?" The answer came as a whisper, ancient and cold, filling their minds with dread, a sacrifice. Emily's blood ran cold. She looked at the totem on the ground, the symbols still glowing faintly, and a horrifying realization washed over her. The totem wasn't just a marker, it was part of a ritual, a binding meant to hold the creature in place, to keep it dormant. And by breaking it, they had released it. "No," she whispered, horror dawning on her face. "We set it free." The creature moved closer, a sense of hunger emanating from it, its hollow gaze fixated on them. It raised one twisted hand, and the shadows around it began to shift and writhe, taking on shapes, figures that looked like faces and bodies, all twisted in expressions of agony and despair. Emily realized with a sickening dread that these were the echoes of others who had wandered too deep into this forest, who had been taken by this thing and trapped in its darkness. Josh backed away, pulling her with him, but there was nowhere left to go. The creature stood between them and every possible escape, its presence pressing down on them like a tangible weight. The shadows encircled them, closing in, leaving them only a few feet of space. In a last, desperate move, Emily looked down at the totem's remains, hoping for any clue, any way to reverse what they'd done. She noticed a small, sharp bone fragment that had broken off, a piece of the totem's base where the symbols seemed the strongest, radiating a dark, eerie energy. Maybe it held some part of the ritual that could protect them, or at least stall the creature long enough for them to escape. "Josh," she whispered, picking up the fragment and clutching it in her hand. Maybe this will help." She didn't know what she was doing, but she held it up, pointing it toward the creature, willing it to stop. The creature halted, its head twisting unnaturally as it regarded the fragment in her hand. For a moment, the shadows receded, and Emily felt a faint glimmer of hope. But then, in a swift, horrible motion, the creature reached out and swiped at her hand, sending the fragment flying from her grip. It shattered against a nearby tree, scattering pieces into the darkness. Emily's hope crumbled with it, and she felt a terrible certainty settle over her. There was no escape. The creature advanced once more, and as it loomed over them, Emily and Josh clung to each other, feeling the encroaching cold seep into their bones. The shadows pressed close, wrapping around them like tendrils, as the whisper filled their minds one final time. The price must be paid. In those final moments, Emily's mind flashed back to the voice she'd heard, the warnings they'd ignored, the strange symbols, and the feeling that they were being watched. It had all been leading to this, a trap set long before they'd ever arrived. The creature extended its clawed hand, and as the shadows closed in, Emily felt a cold, unyielding grip on her heart. The last thing she saw was Josh's terrified face beside her, his hand clutching hers, as the darkness swallowed them both whole. The clearing fell silent once more, the twisted trees standing tall and indifferent. The remains of the totem lay scattered on the ground, and the shadows receded, leaving no trace of the two hikers who had ventured too far into the forbidden forest. And somewhere, deep within the trees, the whisper began anew, calling to the next unwitting soul who dared to enter its domain. Emily's senses came back to her slowly, like fragments of a half-remembered dream. Her mind felt clouded, as though she were submerged in icy water. She blinked, struggling to adjust to the darkness, her body heavy and numb. As her vision began to clear, she realized she was lying on the damp forest floor, surrounded by the gnarled roots of towering trees. A rustling sound came from nearby, and she forced herself to turn her head. She saw Josh lying a few feet away, his chest rising and falling shallowly. Relief washed over her, mixed with confusion and terror. They were still alive, but how? She remembered the creature's claws reaching for them, the sensation of shadows pressing against her skin, and then, nothing. "Josh," she whispered, her voice weak and barely audible. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm. He stirred, his eyes flickering open. "Emily, what happened?" His voice was hoarse, his face pale. He struggled to sit up, glancing around with wide, fearful eyes. I thought we were." "Gone," Emily finished, nodding slowly. She felt the weight of that truth pressing down on her, the reality that they had narrowly escaped something worse than death. But the questions lingered. Why were they still here? And why had the creature left them alive? As they sat there in stunned silence, Emily noticed something strange. Carved into the ground around them was a ring of symbols, similar to the ones they had seen on the totem, and etched into the trees. The markings formed a perfect circle around them, like a boundary that the creature couldn't cross. She reached out to touch one of the symbols, her fingers tracing its jagged lines. I think these symbols are protecting us," she murmured, the realization dawning on her. "It's like some kind of ward." Josh's eyes followed the pattern, his brow furrowed in thought. Maybe. Whoever lived in that cabin. Maybe they were using these symbols to keep it at bay. Emily nodded. "And when we broke the totem, we set it free. But someone must have drawn these symbols here, maybe even to save us." A shiver ran through her at the thought. Who would go to such lengths, in such a dark and dangerous place? And why? The two sat in silence, absorbing the weight of the situation. The circle provided them with temporary safety, but they knew it wouldn't last. The creature was out there, waiting, watching. They could feel its presence on the edges of the clearing, a lurking darkness just beyond their sight. Josh looked at her, his expression grim. "We can't stay here forever. We need to get out of these woods. But if we step out of the circle..." Emily's voice trailed off, her stomach twisting with dread. She could still feel the creature's cold, hollow gaze on her, as if it were waiting for them to make a move, ready to pounce the moment they left the protective boundary. Josh's jaw clenched. "There has to be a way. We can't just sit here and wait for it to find another way in." Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Okay, but we have to be smart. If these symbols are what's keeping it away, maybe we can. I don't know, replicate them? Use them to create a path?" Josh's eyes lit up with a glimmer of hope. "You mean like making a trail of these symbols, something we can follow out of here?" "Exactly," she said, her mind racing. "It might buy us enough time to escape. We just have to remember the way we came in, stay close together, and hope it doesn't realize what we're doing until we're far enough away." Josh nodded, a new determination in his gaze. "Let's do it." They spent a few moments gathering sticks, rocks, and anything they could use to carve the symbols into the forest floor. Emily was grateful that they remembered the shapes. They were etched into her memory, each curve and line burned into her mind like a brand. Together, they worked in silence, creating a trail of protective symbols that stretched out from the circle and led back in the direction they'd come from. Emily's heart raced with every line they drew, each symbol a tiny defiance against the darkness that hunted them. The forest around them felt oppressive. the air heavy and still, as though the creature was aware of their every move. They moved quickly, marking the ground every few feet. The woods grew darker and colder the farther they went, and Emily's nerves frayed with each step. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the creature's twisted form looming behind them. But the symbols seemed to work, creating a barrier between them and the darkness. She felt a glimmer of hope taking root, fragile but real. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a familiar stretch of trees, the same ones they had passed on their way into the forest. Emily's pulse quickened as she recognized the faint outline of the trail that had led them here. They were almost out, almost safe. But then, a low, guttural sound echoed through the trees, freezing them in place. The creature had realized what they were doing. Emily glanced at Josh, panic flashing in her eyes. "We have to run." They sprinted down the path, their feet pounding against the earth, branches snapping beneath them. The forest around them seemed to close in, shadows reaching out as though trying to snatch them back. The creature's guttural growl grew louder, reverberating through the trees, filling the air with a sense of dread that gnawed at their resolve. Emily clutched Josh's hand, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, refusing to look back. The protective symbols they'd left behind were growing fewer and farther between, the fragile path they'd created growing weaker with each step. Just when she thought they couldn't run any farther, a glimmer of light appeared through the trees ahead. Her heart soared as she recognized the faint outline of their car parked on the side of the road, just where they had left it. They burst out of the tree line, stumbling onto the dirt road, gasping for breath. Emily glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding, but the creature had not followed. The shadows seemed to linger at the edge of the forest, held back by the last few symbols they had carved, like an invisible barrier between two worlds. They didn't waste a moment. Josh fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the car. They climbed in, slamming the doors behind them, their hearts still racing. As they sped down the road, putting distance between themselves and the cursed forest, Emily felt the lingering chill start to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief. They were safe. They had escaped. But as they drove, a nagging thought crept into her mind, chilling her once more. She remembered the symbols, the ancient language carved into the bones, and the strange figure that had protected them in the clearing. Whoever had once lived in that forest had known about the creature, known how to hold it at bay. But now, with the totem destroyed, that ancient protection was broken. The creature was free to roam the forest, waiting for the next person to wander too close, to ignore the warnings, and to fall prey to the darkness. As the forest disappeared behind them, Emily whispered a silent prayer for anyone who might one day step into those woods, drawn by the same curiosity that had nearly been their undoing. And in the back of her mind she could still hear the creature's whisper, faint but unmistakable. The price must be paid. Emily's heart still pounded even as they left the forest behind, the towering trees thinning and giving way to open stretches of road. The quiet hum of the car's engine should have been comforting, but it only served to amplify the silence between her and Josh. The memory of the creature, the cold, hollow feeling of its gaze, the dread that had wrapped around them like fog, still lingered like a shadow in her mind. Josh's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his face set in a stony expression, eyes focused intently on the road. Every so often, he would glance at the rearview mirror, as if expecting to see that horrific figure following them. Emily finally broke the silence. Do you think it's over?" Josh didn't answer at first. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I don't know. I keep feeling like it let us go." He looked over at her, fear flashing in his eyes. "Like we're still part of whatever it wanted." A chill ran down Emily's spine. "It's almost like it wanted us to leave." Josh let out a shaky breath. "Maybe it's bound to that forest, or maybe it's not done with us yet." Emily shivered, glancing over her shoulder at the stretch of road they'd left behind, expecting to see nothing but darkness. But for a split second, in the reflection of the car's rear window, she thought she saw a faint shadow move. Her heart skipped, her breath catching. But when she looked again, there was nothing. She turned back around, forcing herself to breathe. We need to get far away from here. The next few hours passed in a tense silence, the road stretching ahead of them under a sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. They reached a small town, far from the forest, and checked into the first motel they saw. They barely exchanged a word as they gathered their things and made their way to their room, too shaken to talk about what they'd endured. Inside, Emily dropped onto the bed, her body heavy with exhaustion, her mind racing. She lay there staring at the ceiling, the images of the forest, the totem, and the creature playing on an endless loop in her mind. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, to convince herself they were safe now. But the nightmares started as soon as she drifted off. She found herself back in the forest, stumbling through the darkness, Josh nowhere in sight. The shadows closed in, and she could feel the creature's presence, lurking just out of reach, whispering in a voice that seeped into her bones. The price must be paid. She awoke with a gasp, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. It was still early morning, the first pale light seeping through the thin curtains. Josh was sitting by the window, staring out, as if he hadn't slept at all. "Did you hear it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Josh looked over at her, dark circles under his eyes. "Hear what?" Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the motel blanket. The whisper, in my dream, it kept saying the price must be paid. Josh's face went pale, his expression haunted. "I heard it too, not in a dream. I swear I heard it just now, outside." They exchanged a look of pure terror, the realization settling over them that whatever was tied to the forest hadn't let them go. Instead, it had followed them, a silent shadow lurking on the edge of their consciousness. They hurriedly packed their things, the urge to put distance between themselves and the motel overpowering. As they left, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching them. She glanced over her shoulder as they stepped outside, but the empty parking lot greeted her with nothing but stillness. They got back into the car, the weight of fear heavy between them, and drove without any particular destination, driven only by a desperate need to escape. Mile after mile passed, and slowly, the tension eased, exhaustion taking over as they realized there was no sign of pursuit. They pulled over in a quiet rest area to take a break, and Josh leaned against the hood of the car, looking lost in thought. "We're going to have to live with this, aren't we?" he murmured, staring off into the distance. "Like, it's never really over." Emily stood beside him, feeling the same sense of despair. "Maybe," she said softly. "But maybe we can make sense of it, find some way to make it stop." Josh turned to her, a hint of determination in his gaze. "Maybe we're looking at this the wrong way. If those symbols could protect us, maybe there's a way to seal it back into the forest. Maybe the totem was part of something bigger, something to keep it bound." Emily looked at him, hope flaring in her chest. "You mean we could put it back? Keep it from hurting anyone else?" Josh nodded. "We just need to understand how the symbols work, how the totem was made. If we figure that out, maybe we can restore it." The idea was terrifying, yet somehow it felt like the only option. They had been drawn into the creature's curse, and now they felt responsible for breaking the cycle, for ending the terror that lurked in that forest. "We'd need help," Emily said. "Maybe there's someone out there who knows the history of that forest, who understands what we're dealing with, someone who could guide us." Josh's expression hardened. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll find someone who knows about these things. We'll do our research, gather what we need, and we'll return to the forest." Emily's pulse quickened at the thought of returning to that cursed place, but a part of her knew it was inevitable. They had stirred something ancient and terrible, and until they put it back to rest, it would continue to haunt them, and anyone else unfortunate enough to cross its path. They got back into the car, the weight of the decision settling over them. As they drove away, Emily felt a strange sense of calm mingled with her fear. They had a purpose now, a mission that gave them a reason to confront their terror. In the rearview mirror, the forest seemed to loom in the distance, a dark reminder of what they had unleashed. And though it was miles away, Emily could still feel its presence, lingering like a shadow in her mind, waiting for their return. But this time, they wouldn't go back unprepared. The air was thick with a familiar chill as Josh and Emily stood once more on the edge of the forest, looking into the tangled darkness. Days had passed since they'd fled the woods, but they had returned now, armed with knowledge, symbols, and a resolve they hadn't had before. They each held bags filled with supplies, chalk, sage, iron nails, and a small replica of the totem they'd broken, crafted with guidance from an elderly historian who had heard of legends surrounding these woods. He had urged them to be cautious, but had given them all the tools they'd need to bind the spirit and end its reign of terror. Josh's hands shook as he pulled out the map they'd created from memory, marking the spots where they'd seen symbols before. "We have to move fast," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The historian said if we're not precise, we might make things worse." Emily nodded, determination hardening her expression. "Let's get it done." They moved through the forest, retracing their steps, each corner more menacing than the last, though now it was infused with a sense of purpose. Each time they reached a marked spot on their map, they stopped to place a new totem, a charm of sorts that would help rebuild the protection that once held the creature. But the forest was alive with shadows, and as they continued, they could feel the weight of something watching them. It was as if the creature sensed what they were doing, and its presence grew stronger, more malevolent, with every totem they set in place. The air grew colder, thick with an unnatural fog, swirling at their feet and masking the path. But they pressed on, moving faster, heartbeats thrumming as if in sync with some unseen, ancient pulse of the forest itself. When they reached the clearing where they had first found the broken totem, Emily pulled out the final piece of their plan, a new totem, etched with symbols to reinforce the ones already placed around the perimeter. Her hands trembled as she placed it on the ground, and as soon as it touched the earth, a low guttural growl reverberated through the trees. A shiver ran down her spine as she looked up, eyes widening. There, at the edge of the clearing, the creature stood, its body a distorted fusion of human and beast, twisted limbs stretching into impossible angles. Its hollow eyes glowed with a terrifying hunger, a gaze that seemed to pierce through their very souls. Josh took a shaky step forward, holding up an iron nail in one hand and a handful of sage in the other. "We're not here to run this time," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The creature let out a bone-chilling scream, a sound that seemed to echo across centuries, filled with rage and pain. It lunged toward them, its clawed hands reaching, but as it crossed into the clearing, it recoiled as though struck, an unseen force holding it back. The symbols were working, creating a barrier, but Emily knew it wouldn't hold for long. They hadn't finished the final piece of the ritual yet. "Emily!" Josh shouted, his voice strained. "Now, start the incantation!" Emily took a deep breath, pulling out the parchment with the ancient words they had learned, her voice shaking as she began to chant. The language felt foreign, each syllable heavy with meaning she couldn't quite grasp. But she spoke with conviction, her voice growing stronger as she continued. The creature writhed and twisted, letting out another scream that seemed to tear through the air, but it couldn't breach the circle. As Emily chanted, Josh scattered the iron nails around the totem, reinforcing the boundary. The fog thickened, swirling faster, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. She could feel the ancient magic taking hold, binding the creature, forcing it back to the place it had come from. With a final shout, Emily completed the incantation, and a blast of energy surged through the clearing. The creature let out one last, anguished wail, its form dissolving into shadow as it was drawn toward the totem, its essence captured and sealed within the carved wood. The totem glowed faintly for a moment, and then the light faded, leaving only a quiet, eerie stillness. The silence that followed was thick and profound. Josh and Emily stood frozen, staring at the totem, barely able to comprehend what they had just done. It's over?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Josh let out a shaky breath, nodding. "I think so. We've sealed it." They stood there, breathless, as the forest slowly returned to its natural state, the weight of the creature's presence fading from the air. The first light of dawn broke over the treetops, casting a soft glow over the clearing, illuminating the totem that now stood as both a warning and a protector. Hand in hand, they left the clearing, leaving the totem behind. As they walked back through the forest, Emily felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, mingled with the relief of finally being free from the creature's curse. But she knew, deep down, that the forest would always hold its mysteries. They had restored the barrier, but they could never truly erase the ancient darkness that lingered there. All they could do was hope that no one else would venture too close, drawn by the same curiosity that had nearly claimed their lives. As they reached the edge of the forest and stepped onto the road, Emily glanced back one last time. The forest seemed almost serene in the early light, the trees standing tall and silent, concealing the horrors they held. And in that silence, she thought she heard a faint whisper, like a memory fading into the wind. "The price has been paid.